So my name is Katherine Darnstadt. I am an architect at Leighton Design, which is my own firm. In my time working at previous firms and then once starting Leighton Design, we'd worked on several community and corridor plans, and we kept hearing the same thing over and over. You know, what do we do about our vacant storefronts? How do we support our local small businesses? What do we do about vacant land in our neighborhood? How do we create stable neighborhoods so people don't leave and they want to come back? And it didn't matter where you were in the city, you heard the same thing. So it didn't matter if you were in Lincoln Park or you were in Austin or you were in Chatham. Everyone who was concerned about keeping their neighborhood healthy, vital, knew the impact of having unique businesses there, not only to serve the neighborhood, but also keep those neighborhood residents who have the businesses, keep finding them opportunities to thrive and not move to the southwest suburbs or not move out west or not even just leave the city completely. Because we know there's been a continued population decline in certain neighborhoods in our cities on the south and the west side that hasn't been in elsewhere. And so looking at that and coming from a background with looking at affordable housing design, I was wondering, why don't we have affordable commercial design? Like where is that? You have a commercial real estate industry that keeps wanting to have larger clients, longer terms. I understand the need and the desire to have that level of stability, but also in my own neighborhood, you would see a storefront vacant for years before finally you get a mobile store. Like, I don't see my quality of life actually improving at that point. So we had an idea, and it had been floating around in our head, like, could you do, pop-up retail? Could you do micro retail? We saw this in London, New York, San Francisco, Tokyo. Like, there are plenty of examples. I feel like half of my architecture school notes was looking at small storefronts throughout the world, and it's like, we don't have this here. And I wasn't convinced we didn't have it in Chicago. At first I was like, I'm just looking in the wrong place. I'm gonna go search for it. And so it came down to starting to search for where was this small building example. Because I knew we had minimum building sizes per the code and per zoning, but where was a small building example in Chicago? And when you look at it, it only exists as a concession stand within the realm of the park districts, or it exists as a newspaper stand. And you could actually track the areas throughout the city where newspaper stands were very common and then slowly got regulated out of existence. So you could do a map of newspaper stands were allowed, and then an alderman had an amendment to outlaw any new newspaper stands in their neighborhood, and then slowly newspaper stands were completely outlawed. And there's only a handful that exist. You hardly ever see them open. They can't upgrade their structures, because if they do, then they'll have to close because they won't meet current building code. So they exist in like a moment of stasis, just as is, until they basically fall over, And so with that, it's like, well, these are the first examples of community hubs, entrepreneurship. We could go to Santa Monica and see a bunch of small storefronts. Like, we could build this in Chicago. Around that same time, the city had released an RFP around activating public plazas. So we created a team and created a response to that RFP, sent our proposal in. In it, it had this idea of micro retail, sent it in, fingers crossed, left it, About a year later, the city came back and said that they selected our proposal, and that's was the pathway to actually get it done. Because their first question is like, we specifically like this. How are you going to do it? And our response was, we're pretty sure everything's illegal right now, so you have to help us. Because it was. And that's kind of the long answer of how that came to be, is how, like, if we're looking for an affordable commercial solution for our corridors, if we really want to look at economic development and corridor revitalization in a very real manner, we have to make affordable solutions, and that was the start of something. So it was always about, how do you bridge that gap between startup and storefront in a shifting economy that now even more so has flex workers and second job and, hobbyists who create crafts and sell their products and their passions, but they're not going to ever scale up, nor do they want to a large 2,500, 5,000 square foot space. So we have to make that space ourselves and make it available. The reason that RFP came out, so it came out of the CDOT department, Chicago Department of Transportation, and it was part of their new initiative dealing and looking at placemaking, broadly defined on the areas that they controlled. So they're public spaces, so that'd be streets, sidewalks, alleys, plazas. And they had created a whole entire Make Way for People program specifically looking at placemaking in public spaces. Then the Activate program, that RFP came specifically looking at public plazas. So they were looking at a way, because as a whole, placemaking in the city is not funded. How we use our public space and open space impact fees don't go towards the maintenance of existing spaces. There isn't a revenue model to actually maintain public spaces or plazas in that way within the city. It falls under each alderman and whether they decide to allocate any importance or budget to it or not. And so this was a way to maybe show examples and find a way to generate revenue. It was originally an advertising contract. So the proposal was, hey, advertisers, come put your advertising on these public plazas. You could put billboards, you could put, digital signs, you could put wayfinding, anything that you want to generate revenue, as long as that revenue came back and we could fund arts and culture. And I kind of thought, we have a tag, like a Google alert for anything placemaking, and it came up, read the brief of it, and I was like, well, seeing billboards on all of our public spaces kind of would suck. As a personal, like, here's a citizen me talking like, oh, I don't want to see that on my walk to work. So our response was, maybe there's a different way you could generate revenue, and maybe there's a way that we could actually look at this as maybe unpacking and fixing a system, because we saw, and I still do, public plazas are the physical remnant of aldermanic privilege. When you map it out and how public plazas come to be, they're usually a street gets vacated. So there was a diagonal street or something cutting through, connecting two streets, that gets vacated and you make a larger plaza. Or it was kind of the little, they're called pork chop islands, so the little pedestrian islands that exist at an intersection, those get larger and then you get a plaza. They usually come to the attention of CDOT is because an alderman might put it on his or her menu funding, as this is something that they want to do, so they push that forward, or they ask for a street to be vacated. So when you map out all the existing public plazas, 33% of them, so a third of them, are in 2 wards on the north side. They are geographically distributed to north white wealthy areas, and there are more than half of the wards don't even have a single public plaza within them. And so when you see that and understand that, we wanted to, maybe naively we're saying, hey, there could be a different way to generate revenue instead of billboards and advertising, and hey, we also need to find a way, we want to show you that this is an inequitable distribution of public space. Maybe there's a way we could find a better way to actually fund, maintain, and grow these sites. Because if you have something in the city you're saying is public and you don't even reach half of it, that can't be right. And that's kind of the position that we put in. So maybe it was a protest proposal a little bit, just to get people thinking, and then we ultimately ended up getting selected, and then we had to make it reality at that point. For them as an adversary, an advocate, yeah, definitely moving forward with the public space, looking at bringing arts and culture, finding funding when we were no longer using advertising funding, finding funds within city budgets to support the program, I think have been very helpful. I think where they might have been, and I wouldn't say it was necessarily an adversary, I would just say it would be very weak, is actually promoting the program. And talking to their leadership, because leadership has changed, mayors have changed. I mean, we've been through multiple commissioners, and it's something that they actually have to be proud of and support and say, and sometimes you have to acknowledge, this isn't an equitable program to date. It hasn't been helping our neighborhoods. We need to find a new way to support this if we want to be a world-class city, instead of the attention going all to parks, right? So the attention goes to parks, and people think parks and public plazas are interchangeable, and they're not. The funding for them is different, the control and management for them is different. And so we need to change that, because a public plaza could have the same impact, outdoor, smaller, hardscape space with plantings, with seatings, with programming, can have just as much impact as a park with a field house, a running track, a playground. And we need to see that those creation of small, safe spaces in our neighborhoods actually help build back, as integral as building back our corridors and our communities, as much as it is supporting small businesses as well. And so that's where, I kind of look for them to push it further, because right now the system as it is actually becomes a burden on community members. And if you can't get a public space, if you don't have a public space in your neighborhood, and the only way you can get it is if your alderman advocates to the department for it, when there might be 100 other more important issues, or it might not be voted on if you go through a participatory budgeting process, if it's not seen as a priority, then how are we going to build equitable neighborhoods if we don't even make equitable spaces for all neighborhoods? It was a year, and everyone tells me this was very fast. So from the time we were awarded the RFP and essentially we went through a very long contract negotiation, several months of contract negotiation, because we also wanted to make space in our contract to own an idea, to own a trademark, to be able to work with different departments if it was successful or not, just allow this to maybe grow. We had to plan a contract for best case scenario and worst case scenario, right? And your typical architectural contract doesn't have that in the same way that it would with a city, right? So we had a long process with that. We actually had to write an ordinance or modify an ordinance to make the structure exist, because there wasn't anything that we could call it. There wasn't a concession stand, it wasn't a newspaper stand, it wasn't a food truck, it wasn't a mobile boutique, which didn't exist at that time, still doesn't legally even though we have them. It wasn't, a house, it wasn't a store. It didn't have a category. So we had to make the category. So Boombox is the brand name of what's called a temporary vendor structure. A temporary vendor structure is twofold. So let's unpack that name. That has a very specific name of what it's doing. It's like designed by committee name. It's a very legislative policy name. So temporary vendor it's temporary vendor and temporary structure, even though it's a temporary vendor structure. So temp vendor meaning it would allow for pop-up vendors, multiple vendors over the course of a year. Temporary structure, meaning the structure would not be mobile, because mobile meant it had wheels, but it could be temporary, not necessarily less than a year, but it would be a short term, maybe 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, some short term. And it was a structure because it wasn't a building, so it was a structure, because they couldn't find the building category at that time to fit it in, so it was a structure. And so Boombox is really a temporary vendor structure, so we had to write the new ordinance to modify the ordinance to make the temporary vendor structure exist, present that to City Council, and then get that approved. And once that was approved, then I could build a temporary vendor structure on the site. Mind you, we were already building one anyway, because in that amount of time between contract negotiation, writing the ordinance, the deadline to that thing opening never moved. So the deadline always stayed the same of when the city wanted to have a ribbon cutting, which was early September of 2015, but we didn't get in front of council until June. And so we were building it already, and because we knew we had to drop it on the site, like at the beginning, sometime in August, do whatever work we need to do to finish it up, and then open it. So it was very hectic, because technically, council could have not approved it, and I would have had a boombox in my warehouse, just hanging out there, and it would have never existed. So if council said no, if it didn't pass unanimously, it wouldn't exist. It would still only be, a prototype in a garage somewhere. So yeah, that's how that all came to be. So it allowed us, that's a short term, so it was about a year from getting the contract, the call that we were going to be awarded the contract, going through contract negotiations, modifying the ordinance, getting it passed by city council, going through the 30, 60 days you have to wait before it actually becomes law, and then like 2 weeks later we opened up the boombox and put it on the site. So there are occupancy limitations to the boombox itself. A lot of that stems from public health regulations and the fact that we have all the other utilities except water on site. So from that we eliminate anything that needs water, which is most food vendors, food preparation. You could have previously prepared foods that are pre-packaged in a commercial kitchen. You could have them on site, but surprisingly it also limits a lot of beauty services, which was a very large interest from people who wanted to rent. So we had to limit it to beauty products versus beauty services. And that could be any beauty service from doing your nails, to hair braiding, to eyelash extensions, all of these things that you think are pretty commonplace but are actually really overly regulated in the city. In many cities, salons, women's salons are more overly regulated than you would think. So food and beauty services became the two more restrictive areas. We could still have them. It requires additional certifications and licensures on the vendor part, but we mostly stick to retail and services and arts and culture. So we've had a theater in there, a one-person theater. We've had a concert out of one of the boom boxes. We've had a whole host of businesses, from women's clothing. We have custom-made hats. A Milner in one of our places, who their first weekend they opened, they sold out 30% of their stock that they brought in. So they are loving Chicago right now. They're from Detroit, so they came in. They're loving the city. And jewelry, furniture designs, and we've been able to see our vendors, a select group of them who were interested into going into true storefronts, now open them. So we probably have about 10 to 12 success stories of vendors who started in various boombox locations, were then able to leverage that experience into a storefront, or a loan to help get a storefront, or a revised business plan sometimes, because how you operate when you're at a festival or working at a festival, or working at a shorter term pop-up, or working still out of your house, is very different once all of a sudden you put your business pro forma together for a storefront. And that is the first time that many of them have been in a true storefront, where they could start to look at how much time would I be spending, what would staffing be looking like, things like that. And then we also help some of the vendors by providing services, consulting services, or connections to a lawyer, or to a business consultant, or an IT consultant, a graphic designer, so that they could look at the time that they're in the boombox as time to really a boot camp for their business. So they're not only selling their product, their passion, and themselves, but they're actually scaling up as well. Look at like how boombox can grow. I mean, so for us as an architecture firm, so boombox was incubated in Leighton Design. So this was truly an architectural and urban design proposal that now became a separate business. And now as we look at that business of boombox, what does that look like as it grows? So we've had to go through and really learn from a lot of the entrepreneurs that we work with as they're scaling. They're like, this is a thing that should go to other cities. And then other cities have approached us and said, this is a thing that we want in our city. We want to change our policy. We want to support our businesses. We saw the example of Chicago and we want to do it here. How could you help us? So it's been a response to the demand that we see we need to grow. And so there will be other iterations of it in other cities in 2020. And I think the next thing that we really were looking at is how does this fit in with, we were on the front end of modular construction in Chicago, really looking at what does modular retail and commercial spaces, can that fit within the same realm? So how do we scale up what that construction looks like? I think it's very important when we consider conversations of what commercial corridors look like that have it's not even just a gap tooth kind of situation. It's where you have more than 50% vacancy or lots, and the city is the largest landowner. Between the city and the county, they own the most land in Chicago. How do we also start to make solutions that they could provide structures that people can move into? And how do we find finance structures that someone who has a great business, who sees that 200, 400 square feet is absolutely the perfect size for them to actually be successful and not overextend and end up in failure or bankruptcy or overextended? How can we make those structures exist and finance packages exist so somebody can actually buy their own? And that's the big thing that we've been trying to work on this year, is meet with banks, meet with lenders, tell them what boombox is, so that when somebody wants to purchase one and put it on their own land or in their own neighborhood, that they start to have the mechanisms available to do that. So that's where our next level advocacy is looking at.
Can you speak to
why I decide to work in the neighborhoods and on the projects that I do is because it's reflective of the community that I'm a part of. So I think for me it's very easy to, I don't have to think about it. You know, I want to work from where I'm from, what I know, with people who look like me, act like me, you know, are part of the neighborhoods that I've lived in and part of the businesses that I frequent, and that's how I choose to use my skill as an architect and use the firm. So those are very strong issues. I think the personal advocacy has gone into the professional role, and I think that was a decision very early on. We had the choice with some projects that we were pursuing whether we wanted to become more activists or not, and I think we made that decision, and I made that decision to lead the firm in that way. So there were key points where you think like, oh, maybe we've gone too far, you know, if I keep you know, working this way, am I going to get hired again? You know, and you have these moments of self-doubt where you want to conform more because it's comfortable and it's safer, but I don't think that would have made the work any better, and I don't think it would have made any difference to the broader community in the end. I think in the end, the other thing that I saw is when we started to take these incremental risks, the amount of impact we were able to have shifted significantly. So our role is, your role as a citizen, you have a certain level of voice, and people listen to you or they don't. As an architect, you have, as a professional, you in a field, you might have a little bit more. As an architect, you have more ears, right? You could talk to policymakers and aldermen. You know, you kind of wear a white hat at this role, right? Trust your expertise. Then when we started to construct some of our projects, we had a very different role then. We're manifesting, we're physically creating the space and the thing, and that has a certain amount of power of knowing how to put something together. Designing an object is one thing, putting it together and constructing it has a whole different level of influence on top of that, and a different level of interaction with the public. And then when we developed our first thing, that was really where a huge shift in power and our power structure came, because if we developed a new thing in the city, a new space, we had more authority. Even though we were saying the same thing. From a citizen, I'm saying I want, you know, equitable places and spaces in my neighborhood, to a developer saying I want to develop equitable spaces and places. That has more power than the citizen, and I'm the same person. It's all of a sudden how the perception has shifted of what we're doing, and seeing that power imbalance in person is frightening, but it's also incredibly illuminating to understanding why we have these power imbalances and differentials within our city currently, because we place more power on trying to convince developers and politicians to actually have an equitable focus, and then we applaud small incremental change like it's some big deal when we're not actually really getting to the core cause of it. So if I could be you know, an ethical developer and look at that and make that the forefront of what we want to do, and talk about it and learn from it and try and, you know, work that way, that's something that I'm willing to do. And that's like the risks. Those are the small incremental risks that we've been able to take, and we take on a lot more risks so that more people can thrive in between. So when it comes down, example for our vendors, we take out the interface with the city part that they normally have to go through. We took that all out for them because we're taking on the maximum risk of creating, building, and owning the boom boxes. They're not. right? They get to be the pop-up vendor, and they get to experience the space and live in the space and be the best that they could be for the 1 month, 2 month, 3 months that they're there, right? And so that's how we kind of manifest that risk and reward back and take it out so that people could thrive in that shorter interim.